Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenanti's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenanti's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the Comic Book Conversation Show. John Suntress here, 2 episodes actually dropping today. If you're not aware, I also talked to Jason Sachs, who co-wrote the American Comic Book Chronicles The 90s book from Tomorrow's, a great look back at the 90s. Very interesting conversation, but the conversation, of course, you've downloaded is one with Denis Kitchen, the great Denis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink Press, the underground cartoonist who then created Kitchen Sink Press to be an underground publisher, and fascinating career. Really interesting look at underground comics that started in the late 60s through the 70s, all the different twists and turns, and so many parallels to today's creator-owned comics. And it's pretty interesting to hear how Denis treated the writers and artists that would submit comics to him, other underground cartoonists, and it's great. It's a really, really interesting conversation about how the books were distributed and the various adventures that Denis found himself both in cartooning and publishing. Of course, he was great friends with Will Eisner and keeper of the Eisner estate and Will's literary agent for many years. We also talk a bit about his written biography of Al Camp, the Little Abner creator, who sadly was a bit of a scandal even in the 70s that a lot of people in the Me Too era can certainly relate to. Pretty interesting stuff about the cartoonist behind Little Abner, a very fascinating biography that Denis co-wrote. I urge you to check that out, as well as Denis's comics and various publications through Kitchen Sink Press. But a great conversation today with Denis Kitchen on today's Word Balloon. It's all brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you, League, for your support. Great response and true great support here in 2019 from the League. A lot of people are helping me out while I get over my illness and are contributing to Word Balloon, subscribing to Word Balloon via Patreon. If you want to do that, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon or go to the Patreon ad at the front page of wordballoon.com. Thank you very much, League of Word Balloon listeners. All right, without further ado, let's get into our conversation now with Denis Kitchen, talking about the history of underground comics on Word Balloon. Denis Kitchen, what a pleasure. Welcome to Word Balloon. Longtime fan of your cartooning, your representation of various creators, and also, of course, Kitchen Sink Press, so welcome.
Well, thank you, John. Happy to talk.
You know, I want to start at the beginning and the underground comic movement. I know you wrote a history of the underground comics, and I'm interested in the start. You're a Milwaukee guy. I'm a Chicago guy.
Yeah.
So and truthfully, I worked at WXRT Radio in Chicago, and that was a station pretty much founded by hippies, honestly. And
wasn't
for real, yeah. And I'm really interested. And if these are naive questions, you'll forgive me. But the underground comic movement. Am I right? Mostly like being sold in like head shops and the like back in the day?
Yeah, no, well into the 90 percentile. You got to remember, the undergrounds preceded what we call the direct market system with specialty comic shops. So in those days, there was no alternative, really. Newsstand distributors wouldn't touch us because we were too wild for them. And honestly, we didn't trust them. They had a reputation for being kind of mafioso.
Yeah.
So, but head shops were kindred spirits. They were happy to have us, and vice versa.
So did you have to go on your own to get the stores?
Yeah,
to carry your books?
There was no mailing list I could buy.
Wow.
I had the advantage of I co-founded the underground weekly newspaper in Milwaukee called the Bugle.
Okay.
And the Bugle was part of a thing called the Underground Press Syndicate, UPS, and they gathered a list of all of the, again, kindred spirits who were putting out papers all over North America. And most of the papers did an exchange program. And so when those came in to the Bugle staff, some of the people would, glance at them, but there was an awful lot. I would tend to save them, and then I would watch for ads for head shops in all the other cities and slowly gather together a mailing list. So it started modestly, and it grew. And then we started, of course, advertising in our own comics for retailers, and before we knew it, we had a pretty good network. And as rickety as it might sound, we sold some pretty strong numbers in those days, numbers a lot of publishers would be happy to have now.
Honestly, I was wondering that because, again, there's this handmade and hand-delivered aspect of what I saw as far as, learning about the underground comic movement. And it is reassuring to hear that, were you able to be a full-time cartoonist?
Well, I was a cartoonist until I decided to become a publisher by default. It's impossible to be both. I soon became a full-time publisher and a part-time cartoonist because the business just demanded a lot of attention. And even though early on I got a partner and I had employees, there still wasn't really time to draw as much as I'd like. So I had to sacrifice a good part of my art career in order to be a publisher. But the thing is, nobody else really wanted to be a publisher. There were 4 companies of any size putting out undergrounds, and the other 3, 2 of them were run by business guys, hippie business guys.
Okay.
The 4th one was technically started by Gilbert Shelton.
Okay.
But he was lucky that he had at least 3 partners who ran the business side. So Gilbert continued to draw while he was a part owner of Rip-Off Press. I didn't have that luxury.
Okay. Honestly, I give you a lot of credit because I know creatives, and I say this myself as a semi-creative. Obviously, we want to do the fun stuff. We don't want to do the business, and that's
exactly.
in every level of creativity. So no, I give you a lot of credit for starting Kitchen Sink Press, and so before we get into Kitchen Sink Press, I am interested because I saw, too, that a lot of your work would wind up in college newspapers and other underground newspapers as well. So was it kind of hand-in-hand with the comics?
It was. I had the idea that, well, first of all, the Bugle, the paper I mentioned earlier that I started, I art directed it, and I knew at least 4 other good cartoonists in Milwaukee, and I basically got them to do a weekly strip along with me.
Okay.
And it seemed a shame that they would only appear in the Milwaukee area. And so we created a thing we call the Krupp Syndicate, and we sent out a brochure to a list of college newspapers and the other undergrounds, and we got about 50 or so to sign up. So that was the way to basically assure the artists they'd get something. Otherwise, they were working for free. The problem is, as you might anticipate, it was hard to get a lot of the underground papers to actually pay. They were happy to get it, but they were generally marginal enterprises. And the college papers we expected to be solid financially just turned out to be often run by flakes who had a high turnover rate. And so we had less than 50% of the customers actually paying.
Wow.
And so at a certain point, I think we did it for a year or so, and then we just said, this is ridiculous, and we just killed it because the business model was built on a flawed assumption that our customers were reliable and solvent.
I understand. I can, I'm hearing a kind of Cheech and Chong kind of conversation. Yeah, man, checks in the mail.
Yep.
Wow. Well, all right, on to Kitchen Sink Press. So, yeah, you become a publisher, and was it really easy to go to the Richard Corbins, R. Crumbs, and, the like of that generation to come in and have their work published by you?
Well, easy is a relative term. Most of the guys I published were friends who I got to know early on or developed relationships with. I tried in as many cases as possible to see them firsthand. Crumb early on traveled to Milwaukee because he was buddies with Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson, the Chicago-based guys who were doing Bijou. And neither he nor Jay drove cars, but they took a bus up, and I gave him a tour, and it helped in Crumb's case that I had a jukebox in my apartment that played 78 RPM records.
Oh, I know.
That's his passion.
Indeed. Absolutely. That's awesome.
So you find things in common that extend beyond just loving comics. And I wrote a lot of letters back then because, of course, again, this is pre-internet, and telephone calls were expensive. Long distance was like a buck a minute, as I recall. So, so nearly everything was conducted via snail mail. And so things didn't happen as fast as they might today, but they happened. And the important thing was to set up an economic system that was fair and that attracted talent. And so early on, I treated comics the way a literary publisher would treat authors. You get a royalty, you get an advance, basically, and the more the book sells, the more the cartoonist would make. And likewise, if by chance there was a European publisher that wanted to translate it, anything like that, we had a way of dealing with it fairly. And I learned my lesson from observing, as best I could, the so-called role models of Marvel and DC and Archie and the existing major companies, because they did everything wrong as far as we were concerned. They kept all the art, they kept the copyrights, they kept nearly all the money. They'd pay a flat rate, and then it was, goodbye, Charlie. And so part of the whole hippie revolution... So you got to keep in mind, John, that back in the old days, we had to do almost everything by snail mail. It was certainly the pre-internet era, and even telephone calls were pretty expensive then. I think long distance was about a buck a minute.
Yeah.
So, I would reach out to artists typically by mail, and we would correspond. I had no idea... if you would ask me to count how many letters I was writing, but my papers went to Columbia University a couple of years ago, and they counted 65,000 letters.
Jesus, wow.
So I was typing away, and it would have helped if I had ever taken a typing class, but I didn't. So I was basically a two-fingered terror.
Sure.
But things got done. Things did get done.
I think it's reassuring that the business is so cyclical, because I have friends that have made independent comics and they self-published. Now they are going to the direct market. But yeah, they're pretty much hand selling, and now there are lists and things, and certainly the internet is a big help. But it really doesn't sound that different with what creator-owned people that are self-publishing have to go through today. And I mean, tell me the differences, because I know you get very involved, and certainly did, in your years of. We'll get to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, but yeah, tell me about that. The differences you see in today's creator-owned, self-publishing kind of world.
Well, the main difference is back then it was a lot less competition.
Sure.
Today the market is pretty flooded, and that comes from a good thing, which is comics and graphic novels have become accepted as really now a mainstream form of communication. It's part of the world of literature that I couldn't have ever been sure would happen. You walk into a Barnes & Noble now, and you'll see a whole section of graphic novels, just like you would in any other category. When I was starting out, that was an impossible dream. So that's why we were forced to work with head shops, and the format was the floppy comic book format for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So the parallel, though, is that for any independent artist who's not doing a superhero-type material for the mainstream, you really have to hustle, and there's no easy way to get around it. And so small press is small press.
It's really, honestly, I love hearing about the way it worked back then. Were there any sort of, if not conventions, any sort of happenings? Because I would think the kind of art that you guys were doing would certainly fit into like the music culture or something like that. So were there, beyond actually like meeting the creators that you did, whether you traveled to their cities or they came to your city, in Milwaukee and stuff? Yeah, were there any gatherings of underground creators?
There were 2 or 3 that were held in Berkeley in, I think, 1973, 74, maybe 75, that were dedicated 100% to undergrounds. So that was the comics Woodstock of its day.
Sure.
Relatively small affairs, but it was a gathering of the tribe, so to speak.
Did you bring your books and I mean did you do?
Oh, sure.
Did you do? Yeah, obviously you'd hand sell, but
panels.
Did panels? Okay. Did you sketch as well? Would you guys do sketches for fans?
Yeah, there was even Harvey Kurtzman, the creator of Mad, was a guest at one, and he introduced us to a thing in French they call a tac-a-tac, which is a very large jam where you imagine a piece of paper about 10 feet high by, 15 feet wide, and it's tacked up, and then every artist gets basically a marker, and you just start drawing and riffing off of each other, and so something like that was a kind of a spontaneous, fun thing that you wouldn't otherwise have a chance to participate in. But for the most part, outside of the Berkeley events, no, we would meet at, to the degree there were other conventions. Remember, they were far, far less frequent in those days. You had a big one in New York and San Diego early on and Chicago. But now, they're all over God's creation, and even in relatively small towns and overseas. So they've kind of lost the I would say the special nature of when you'd wait for one almost a year maybe, and regionally you might only have one big one in a year.
I remember being a kid and seeing the ads for the Chicago conventions when, like you said, there were only like really 3 big ones for the superhero fair. But you mentioned that obviously your stuff sold outside of the United States and Europe and the like. So how were underground comics received in these other countries?
Well, certainly Canada was a given, but most of Europe was a strong market too. And in general, they were very well received. The only problem we had was occasionally we'd have problems with customs agents who would seize packages, and that was always a risk because someone might claim they were obscene or otherwise objectionable. We also shipped to Australia, New Zealand, basically any countries that spoke English or had a significant number of the population that spoke English. Germany was a big importer, France, Spain.
Cool. That's amazing.
So it was great, and it augmented sales. And there were burgeoning underground comics movements happening in some of those countries as well. So I think we helped feed that frenzy and vice versa. The French were the most successful. The group that started Metal Hurlant, which in the U.S. became known as heavy metal.
Yep.
They were, but they had the advantage of the French distribution system required that the national periodical distributors carry small press. And so when I referred to ours earlier as being kind of mafioso and scary, in France it was the opposite. The government required that they be distributed. Now, that didn't guarantee that they were sold, of course. You might get massive returns, but at least you had an opportunity to get on newsstands. And so that allowed the French underground cartoonists to get much more successful in terms of circulation and the kind of money they could make. And they became much bigger names in that market than, I would say, almost everybody outside of Crumb and maybe Gilbert Shelton, maybe Art Spiegelman in our crowd.
That's pretty amazing. I'm curious about one project you did with Stan Lee in the 70s, and that was it comix books with an X?
Yeah, Comics with an X. Yeah, we actually just a couple of years ago put together a book about that, and
yes.
Stan was kind enough to write an intro for it. Basically, that came out of the fact that early on, inexplicably, Stan and I became pen pals. He, I was a fanboy, of course, growing up with Marvel, and I was surprised when he would answer letters and send me letters, and there was something about me he liked, and he offered me a job several times in the early 70s.
Wow.
And each time, even though I loved Marvels growing up, the idea of moving to New York and working for a company that put out superheroes didn't hold any appeal because I enjoyed what I was doing. I wasn't getting rich fast, but it was part of a movement consciously.
Sure. Wow.
Didn't want to work for the man, even if it was Stan the man. No. But then a strange thing happened in the summer of 1973. We noticed our sales precipitously dropping for a combination of reasons. First of all, the Supreme Court made a new ruling on obscenity, which basically threw it back into the laps of localities to determine what was objectionable, and that put the fear of God in most head shops because they were already considered kind of outlaw businesses in most communities,
sure.
And they feared that if the local citizens could decide what was obscene or not, it would be the undergrounds would be an excuse to put them out of business, even though the real objection was they were selling, drug paraphernalia.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of shops suddenly say we can't carry comics anymore.
Wow.
And then at about the same time, we noticed an after effect of our policy of selling comics on a non-returnable basis, which was very efficient and for us great. But if you were a non-discerning retailer who was just saying, give me a dozen of each, the stuff by Crumb and Shelton and the better selling things would disappear from your rack, but you'd get stuck with the relative dogs, and they'd get, dog-eared and to a point where they were clogging up the rack. And so all the retailer would see is, I've got a lot of unsold comics.
Sure.
And so for separate reason, they started declining to buy. And so I was in a real tough predicament the summer of 73. Just as Stan called and offered me a job again, and this time I said, let's talk. And so I flew to New York, and basically he wanted me to come and, be part of the bullpen and edit books. I didn't want to do that, so I offered a compromise where I could stay in Wisconsin. I could deliver a magazine to him on a quarterly basis, or bi-monthly, I guess it was, and do everything from where I was, and that would save him, some office space, and I would work at Wisconsin wages instead of New York wages. And
okay.
Basically, it was enough of the package he wanted that he accepted it, and so that's how this incongruous thing called Comics Book happened. And for the underground cartoonist, it meant suddenly the page rate quadrupled, and we had newsstand distribution, so an entirely new audience saw what we were doing. So it turned out to be good on some levels. On the other hand, one of the requirements that I insisted we have was we could use swear words, we could have, reasonable amount of nudity and be political, and basically it was underground comics slightly milder than you'd get in a head shop. And for Stan, that still caused a problem because one of the other conditions I extracted was we'd get our original art back and we could retain our copyrights. And we compromised so that Marvel would hold the copyright for a short period of time, but then they would revert but the artwork we got back, and they didn't do that with any other Marvel artists, and that created a backlash, as you can imagine, in terms of the regular Marvel artists. When word got out, eventually, as I am told by insiders, these guys would come to Stan and say, "Why are you giving these hippies a better deal than us?" And so basically, Stan couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. And after 3 issues, he called me and he said, "Look, I got to kill it."
Wow.
And I already had 2 more in the can, but he graciously allowed Kitchen Sink to publish them, even though Marvel had paid the contributors. So all in all, it basically bought me a year of time in which Marvel subsidized me and a lot of my artists. And after a year, the market rebounded, and the Supreme Court decision didn't really have a significant effect, and neither did the small number of retailers who stopped ordering because of non-return. So without that year of Stan effectively subsidizing the operation, I'm not sure we would have survived. It's a nice little irony.
Yeah. Well, and also, I'm glad that, he was cool enough to let you publish the stuff through Kitchen Sink Press. And as you say, the decision by the courts, I guess had a lingering effect, and I'm assuming it kind of led to you forming the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, because it is obviously the huge problem of community standards of what's acceptable and what isn't. That is a constant fear of stores and creators in today's environment.
Yeah, the CBLDF came somewhat later.
Sure.
The late 80s, but yes, it was always a problem, but it wasn't a problem that was publicized. As I found out later, you'd have incidents in small towns, all over the map, but we wouldn't hear about them because usually it meant a small shop would either be intimidated or be driven out of business. And it wasn't until we had the national organization that then we would get word. So,
I remember reading in Comics Journal and Amazing Heroes, it seemed like the comic book press would, and I'm assuming that was your guys doing in terms of, they would report on some of these cases as they were happening.
Absolutely.
So,
and it all started in Chicago, in a suburb of Lansing, as you may know. It was a case we called the Friendly Frank's case. There was a small chain that was in the Chicago area and in Indiana, run by a guy named Friendly Frank. And he had a manager in the Lansing, Illinois shop. And one day, a couple of cops came in and looked over the stuff on his shelves, confiscated a dozen or 15 or so titles, and arrested him for displaying obscene material. And when Frank called me, I was appalled that happened. And I was even more appalled when I read the local newspaper account, because they quoted one of the officers who was dumb enough to talk to a reporter. the cop said, "Yeah, the place was full of satanic images. Even Wonder Woman posters on the wall that were satanic." So clearly this was some kind of religious sect fanatic who, saw the devil in everything. And some of the things he confiscated were relatively mild, along with some things that, you could argue certainly had sexual content, but they weren't obscene by the legal definition. They weren't being sold to minors, and they were displayed, properly. So that case upset me so much that's why I started the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, to raise money to defend this manager who faced jail time and a significant fine if he had been convicted. And he was convicted at the local level. We had to appeal it to the state appellate court, where we turned it over. And at that point, there was still money left in the funds, so I decided to make it a permanent organization. When we started, I had no idea that it would still be going to this day.
Yeah, I spoke to Christina Merkler, the current president. Just a month or two ago. She's an old friend. We've been doing business. Okay. Oh yeah, she's been a longtime sponsor of my podcast. So she and her husband Cam, yeah, they're great people. And Fort Wayne, Fort Wayne, not too far when they originally started. They've since. I don't know where they're at. I know they're moving back. Maybe they are moving back to Indiana. I'm not sure. But anyway, no, truly, God, thank God you guys are out there, man. And I know, are you in an advisory capacity? Have you? I
am now, yes. I'm not involved day to day. After running it for 18 years, I just thought I needed fresh blood. And so I resigned, and I also encouraged term limits, which the board adopted. So now basically you can serve up to 6 years, I think it is, and then it keeps it cycling, so new people from the industry come in and it's fresh.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, my fear is, any organization gets run by the same old crowd. It just gets stale. It's not really thinking creatively.
Yeah.
So.
No, I get it. That's, again, it's incredible, and I'm always happy to go to the booth at cons and buy some paraphernalia and absolutely support the fund. No question. So, no, incredible work, man. And truly, you know better than I do in terms of the thin profit margin there is for these comic stores. And when they do get in trouble like that, how quickly they could be run out of business just, from the stress and having to deal with the court costs and everything. So, yeah, yep. I can't imagine, man. And, honestly, it's a weird period now. I fear for new stores. I even have a couple friends that started stores, and I'm like, do you really want to do that now? Because I really think not only in terms of the direct markets challenges, but just in general, brick and mortar stores that aren't tied to some sort of chain. And I mean, I think like I think of Los Angeles and a store like Meltdown Comics. Huge profile. I mean, not only selling books, but becoming kind of a de facto comedy and podcast stage. And all of a sudden they're out of business. And it's like, wow.
I know. I was really sad to see, because I thought they were like a role model.
Sure. 100%, man. No, and again, I'm shrugging. What else can you say? Yeah, I mean, so as someone, and again, you're in an advisory capacity and stuff. Do you keep tabs on today's direct market and what's happening now? I mean, is it? I would assume you'd have to. Are you?
Yeah, Charles Brownstein, the executive director, sends the advisory board members regular updates on what's going on, and we have access to the minutes of the board meetings. And if there's any crisis, those of us who have kind of a corporate memory or can be helpful, are basically sitting on the bench waiting to help. So it's good to be available. Most of the time they don't need us anymore, but we're there to be called on. And sometimes, like I co-chair the advisory board with Neil Gaiman, and he's the kind of guy, sometimes you just drop his name and it's helpful, or a call from him will be helpful, that sort of a thing. So there's many ways an advisory board can be helpful besides just names on a letterhead.
Okay, let's take a break and get into our sponsor. This portion of Word Balloon brought to you by Aftershock Comics, the industry's fastest-growing independent publishing company, promoting both new and established comic audiences to read dangerously. They're claiming 2019 as the year of reading dangerously. As a publisher of many of the most talked-about independent titles of the past few years, things like Marguerite Bennett's Animosity, Garth Ennis' A Walk Through Hell, Dark Arc from Cullen Bunn and Juan Doe, and of course Donny Cates and Baby Teeth, Aftershock is pushing the envelope even further this year with new releases and ongoing series that continue to thrill, chill, and challenge both imaginations and sensibilities. Aftershock is working with top writers and artists and some of the brightest new stars in the creative community. Some of the new titles that are coming out this year, things like Stronghold with Phil Hester and Ryan Kelly, Oberon, a new supernatural series featuring Ryan Parrott, Dark Red, a vampire living in rural America from Tim Seeley, and things like Out of the Blue and Horde. They're going to cut across all genres to take readers far beyond the comfort zones. Now, in the weeks ahead, we'll be talking to more Aftershock creators about their books, but you don't have to wait. Go to their website. You'll find full story descriptions, preview pages, and the diamond codes on these books to order through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. All right, let's get back into our conversation now on Word Balloon. I also wanted to talk about your various histories of comics as well. We mentioned the underground comics history that you co-wrote. You also co-wrote a Harvey Kurtzman biography and one on Al Cap, certainly. And now, I really want to read the Kurtzman one. I haven't had a chance to read that. I did read the Al Cap one. I was telling you before we started recording that, and also I know that you published a lot of the Little Abner collections through Kitchen Sink Press as well. So
I planned to publish the entire Little Abner library, which would have been, believe it or not, 54 volumes.
Wow!
I got literally halfway, 27 volumes before we had to give it up. But,
wow! So around what year were you in when you had to give it up? 60s?
Basically, when Kitchen Sink Press went under in 1999. So I would have kept with it. I mean, it's a strip I loved, and even though Cap himself left a lot to be desired, to put it mildly, I still think to this day he was a genius cartoonist and satirist.
No question.
It's just, he, as a human being, had some serious deficiencies.
Well, that's why the biography that you co-wrote is so fascinating, because and ever since reading it, I've been scouring YouTube and. I have the channel Decades that runs the old Dick Cavett show, and there's an episode that Cap was on. He was contemplating running for Senate against Ted Kennedy. I don't know how serious he was, but and also the great thing about the Cap book is it gives you this insider look of how the comic strip business worked. And so that was really fascinating. But you're right. The guy's, first of all, as a personality, the guy was everywhere. I mean, I found old-time radio panel shows where he's holding his own with very erudite and funny people.
He's the only cartoonist, certainly of his era, and I would argue a cartoonist, period. You might say, well, Spiegelman, it's hard to come up with anybody even close to Cap because, as you said, he not only did a daily strip that was hugely popular, he was on radio shows, TV shows. For a while, he had his own TV show, his own radio show, his own newspaper column of commentary. He was one of the most frequent guests on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. He was the only cartoonist besides Walt Disney to have a theme park. You can just go on and on with this guy. He was all over the map. And when you consider that he started out handicapped, he had one leg. He lost a leg as a child from an accident. And he was able to accomplish an amazing amount. He also was smart enough, savvy enough, and ballsy enough to confront his syndicate at a time when he was already making a lot of money. And he basically bit the hand that fed him by demanding a huge raise. And the syndicate naturally resisted. So he sued them in 1947 for, I think, $14 million in 1947 dollars.
Wow.
And basically, at the time he was suing him, and that alone made headlines, he had a strip that he created in Little Abner that the syndicate was forced to syndicate every day, in which it was about a cartoonist who was chained to his drawing board with one thin bulb hanging over his head, and he was starving. And he was working for an outfit called the Sweat Blood Syndicate, or the Squeeze Blood Syndicate. So, poor United Feature Syndicate, imagine, they had to pay this guy every week while he is mercilessly satirizing them. So after a while, basically, he won. He got concessions. He got a bigger slice of the pie than any cartoonist before and possibly since. And he also was able to get merchandise rights that normally the syndicate would go out and create merchandise. So he was able to then give that to a company that he and his brother started. And after that, all the merchandise went through him. And a year later, he created the Shmoo, which was one of the largest, most successful, things of all time. From 1948 to the early 50s, Shmoo was huge. And instead of dividing it with the syndicate, like most cartoonists, he and his brothers kept it all. So he was very, very savvy.
Wow.
And if he could have just kept his pants zipped, he would have had a much more successful and lengthy career. But he had problems with women, as you know from reading the book.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And honestly, in today's Me Too environment, I think, this was always going on, casting couch kind of things in Hollywood. I don't want to tip. I want people to read the book, but yeah, he had several cases against him, and in that classic old boy way, there were people, and I was just shocked at the players. Should we say it, or how would you prefer it?
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
If people are curious, they can go buy the book. Sure.
Okay, well, it was, he would show up at campuses, and much like there being radio shows and TV shows online, there are copies of albums where he was a liberal, and he took on things like McCarthyism in the 50s, but then I guess the hippies kind of turned him off in terms of who represented liberals during the hippie years. So he didn't
see them as liberal. He saw them as lawbreakers who never bathed and who were violent. Got to remember, Cap lived a stone's throw from Harvard University, and he was basically intermingling with academics and famous intellectuals who were based at Harvard. And when the protests against the Vietnam War started, there was an incident where the president of Harvard was in a car, and hippies surrounded the car, apparently shook it and threw rocks at him. And, it was no doubt an unnerving incident for the college president. And not all protesters were well behaved. But Cap, once that incident occurred, he never changed his mind about all hippies being basically evil, misguided, and he used the power of the pen to attack them mercilessly starting in the late 60s.
Well, and there's that classic scene of John Lennon and Yoko in bed, and Al Cap accosting them, and he's one of those people that...
Yeah, although I have to say, to be fair, John Lennon and Yoko invited him knowing it would be a publicity stunt for both of them. And Lennon egged him on, and if you ever see, there's an uncut version of that meeting where Lennon is also saying some pretty snarky things to Cap. But yes, Cap's behavior is unforgivable, and the worst moment for me was he's talking to Lennon and ignoring Yoko, and at a certain point, even though she's laying on the bed next to John, Cap says to Lennon, "How can you sleep with that thing?" He calls her.
God.
Thing.
Wow. Yeah.
So he found her repulsive, and Lennon only slightly less.
Wow, and then it gets uglier because...
The irony, actually, after he left that sleep-in, he flew back to Boston, seated on an airplane next to Timothy Leary, who he was pals with. But then Timothy Leary was kind of a media whore, too, who, was happy to hang out with all kinds of celebrities. I don't think he was a terribly principled guy in retrospect, but at the time they were an unlikely pair.
Hilarious. Wow. Well, you revealed that, Cap would go to these campuses, and the campus newspaper would send a young female reporter, and he, sexually harassed like four of them.
Not a reporter, no. He asked to interview co-eds. He claimed he was putting together a TV show for CBS TV.
Wow.
Called Sex on Campus. And so he had an advance man who went around to the schools a week or two ahead of time and said, Mr. Cap, at your university would like to interview co-eds. Well, it was always co-eds,
Jeez, wow.
He never interviewed young men. But
sure.
his advance man knew the type of young woman that Cap liked, and so he would basically be introduced to I'm not sure exactly, but maybe a politically active young women, who he would then pick out three supposedly at random, but they would all be good looking, and then they would set up appointments. And so Cap would have a hotel room. They would come to it. When they came in, he would lock the door behind them, and turn on a reel-to-reel tape recorder and begin interviewing them about sex. And because he was a famous guy, I guess they thought they were flattered to be involved. But
Sure.
As the questioning got more and more personal, at a certain point he would stop the tape recorder and he would say to them something like, "Would you like your parents to hear what you just told me?"
Wow.
Basically, again, he's talking to 18-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
Who would panic because suddenly they realized they were being blackmailed into having sex. So the only way he eventually was caught was one of the young women at the University of Alabama ran to the window, managed to open it and scream, and the campus cop heard and came and rescued her, and they escorted him to the airport and told him he was unwelcome at the university. But no charges were pressed. And he still wouldn't have been caught, except one of the women wrote an anonymous letter to the columnist Jack Anderson. At that time, Jack Anderson, who was a famous political columnist who was basically entirely focused on Washington, D.C. events, he had a young, unknown reporter working for him at the time named Brett Hume, and he opened the mail and they saw this unsigned letter claiming that Al Cap was accosting women on campus, and Anderson had no real interest in a sex story because it wasn't really political. But at a certain point, Hume kept reading that letter and he wondered if it were true, it ought to be exposed. And so he got Anderson to agree to have him delve into it. And so he did a very astute thing. He knew if he had called the University of Alabama, they would have denied that the event happened. They wouldn't want bad press. So he called the campus cops, who were not experienced talking to reporters, and he said, "Hey, I heard you took El Cap to the airport at such and such a date." And they said, "Yeah, we got that bastard. We put him on a plane, told him not to come back."
Wow.
So then Britt Hume called the president of the campus and said, "Look, your security has confirmed that there was an incident with Al Cap." They still didn't want to cooperate, but then he said, "Look, we want to prevent this from happening at other campuses. I promise that nothing you say will be used to embarrass you or your campus." So all he asked was to be able to talk to the same women that appointments had been set up with. And he followed El Cap's tour, because he had been touring campuses all around the country for a long time. And he retraced the steps, and he was able to get something close to a dozen, I think, women to tell their story, and a good number of them to sign a legal affidavit. And even then, Cap might not have been exposed if he had been a little bit savvier, perhaps, because once Britt Hume had written the story, Jack Anderson, his boss, said, "Look, we got to give Cap a chance to defend himself here." And so they were in Washington, D.C., they called Cap in Boston, and as soon as they said they were considering this story, Cap ignored his lawyer's advice, jumped on the first plane to Washington, and came into Jack Anderson's office. And he misplayed his hand because he did not know that Jack Anderson was a Mormon, a very religious man, very family-oriented. And so he opened up by saying to Jack, he presumed he was the same as Cap, and he said, "Jack, you know how it is when you go around to these campuses, the young girls, they're all over you."
Wow.
And that so disgusted Anderson that he decided, okay, this is not an overtly political story, but I'm running it. And he did. And that was the beginning of the end for Cap.
That's amazing, man. Yeah. And well, and that's the thing. I wonder, and I even told you off the air, you could make the comparison to Cosby and his importance to comedy. Cap, like we said, an incredibly important figure in comic strip history. All the things he did, good lessons to be learned from his business acumen, horrible person, So
Yep.
your opinion. What do we do? Because that people south of, I'm in my 50s. People south of our age probably don't even know Al Cap.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. Well, there are a number of parallels. I mean, I know people who won't see a Woody Allen movie because
Sure.
of the accusation against them, and that
Yeah.
hasn't even really been proven.
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line? Do you never see a movie that the Weinstein Company made?
Kevin
Where do you
Spacey's
draw the
body
line?
of work. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I
So
understand.
for me, I'm able to separate the man from the work, and
Sure.
I'm happy to put the spotlight on Cap's negative behavior, but I also can go back and read Little Abner and enjoy it for what it is. Not everyone can do that.
Understood. Yeah, no, I find it fascinating. And again, this is, I think, one of the things that our current environment and people in this environment have to make those decisions. But yeah, it's really, the book is incredible. And again, I knew about Little Abner as a kid, probably saw several of your collections growing up in the 70s into the 80s on bookshelves at places like Crocs and Brentano's back in the day.
Sure.
So yeah, but it was really shocking, and I can't recommend it enough. It's an incredible book, so people should definitely seek that out. Can I ask I know I'm exceeding my 45 minutes. Can I ask you real quick about Eisner?
Sure.
Yeah, honestly, I feel very fortunate I got to meet him. He came to the University of Chicago, interviewed by Neil Gaiman, and they had a humanities weekend, and Spiegelman was there, Scott McCloud was there.
I heard about that. That was quite the crowd.
Yeah, it was really impressive, and it was great because it was a university atmosphere. So after their Q&A on stage, they hung out in the lobby, and anyone could just walk up and talk to Neil and talk to Eisner, and it was so exciting. And I know I had several Spirit collections, both from Kitchen Sink and even the Warren Spirit previous to your publishing Will's stuff. How did that relationship with Will begin?
In a very unexpected way. I was invited by Phil Suling to my first convention in 1971 in New York.
Sure.
And I was relatively unknown then. I mean, I had only been publishing for I think a little over a year maybe. And I was basically just a fanboy. I was looking through boxes of comics when a French comics historian named Maurice Horn saw my badge, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Kitchen, Will Eisner, he is looking for you."
Wow.
And I said, "You must be mistaken. I don't know Mr. Eisner. I can't imagine why he would be looking for me." And he said, No, come with me." So he took me to this private suite where Will was, and it turned out that Eisner was fascinated with the underground comic scene. And he started peppering me with questions about how they're distributed and how the royalty system works and all these things he had vaguely heard about. He wanted confirmed. He wanted more detail. And while he was peppering me with questions, I was trying to, the fanboy in me was wanting to ask him about the old days, but he had very little patience for that. And it was the first lesson I learned that he was an insatiably curious guy who was not stuck in the past, but always looking at new trends and wanting to be part of it. And so it was a very unlikely meeting. I actually drew a picture later of this meeting of basically a balding guy in a three-piece suit, and me with hair down to mid-back and bell-bottom jeans and a scruffy beard. And as Will would say years later, we both smoked pipes but with different substances. But the one thing we had in common was a love of comics. And so after that meeting, we stayed in touch. And before long, I was bold enough to ask about reprinting The Spirit. And before I knew it, I was his publisher and published every one of his graphic novels right up until 1999. And then when Kitchen Sink Press went under, he asked me to be his literary agent, and so I represented him on subsequent books until he died in 2005. And I still act as literary agent and the art agent for the family.
That's great, and truly, I'm glad that you and the Eisner Estate are making that stuff still available. And also, I've loved over the years the various tribute publications when others have done the Spirit. I really, really groundbreaking work. But then also his subsequent graphic novels as well, The Dreamer and Contract with God and the like. I mean, yeah, it's a great body of work, and that he was still vital all the way till the end. That's that's great.
Yeah. And again, younger listeners may not be aware that he basically started the graphic novel revolution. You cannot say in academic terms he was the very first, but he did the first successful graphic novel with Contract with God, and that spawned basically everything that's come since, because contemporaries like Alan Moore and Frank Miller and Spiegelman and others followed in quick succession, because it was exciting to see that. You got to remember, until Contract with God, everything was the floppy. It was the comic book.
Sure.
To have a comic with a square spine you could put on a shelf with real books, that was psychologically very important. And it also broke open the format. It allowed you to tell a story that was 150 pages long and not 32 pages long. It revolutionized our business.
No question. And that's pretty amazing that you got to be a part of it. Another thing I loved about the Spirit Quarterly that you put out was Shop Talk at the back, and I have the collection. It's sitting on my shelf. I'm looking at it right now. I also have the wonderful documentary that John Cook made that included the audio. Actual interviews, and being an audio guy, I'll tell you, man, you appreciate the nuances of the conversation even more so than the transcribed versions. And yet, oh my God, they're so great. You hear the kind of bitter irony that Jack Kirby feels about Stan Lee, and great conversation with Phil Suling, great conversations with Kniff, his creative, role model. I mean, great stuff, man. Oh, I love all of that. And also, it's just been great to talk to various creators who knew him better, and that, like you said, he generally was interested in what was happening now and really wanted to learn and hear about, the current comic market and what was going on. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a very forward thinker, which is rare. At a time when his contemporaries had basically retired, he was still doing great things. He was almost 88 years old when he died, and he was ready to start a new project.
Wow. My friend Alex Savick helped him out with that little short story that he did where the Spirit met the Escapist.
That's right. I remember that.
Yep. Yeah, that was really neat.
That was the last thing he did.
Wow. Unbelievable, man. So, what are you doing these days? What keeps you busy?
Well, I'm still an agent. I represent a number of cartoonists and writers. I package books. I have an imprint at Dark Horse called Kitchen Sink Books, as opposed to Kitchen Sink Press.
Okay.
And with a partner, John Lind, we do 2 or 3 books a year for them. The most recent one was the Deluxe Contract with God, which had 1 volume of the original pencils and another companion volume with all the final inks with a lot of commentary. So if you're a real student of the graphic novel form, or someone like Eisner, you get to see literally the very first steps of it and how he changed his own ideas and altered many of his original pencil concepts, how he omitted some pages. It's a rare insight, because very, very seldom, in fact, I can't think of another occasion where these things survived on a classic and you could show that progression. So we enjoyed putting that together. Right now I'm working on a 3D portfolio. I'm intrigued by 3D. And my daughter and I just co-wrote a book on Harrison Cady, who is a kind of a forgotten cartoonist who was huge in the early part of the 1900s, doing amazing centerfolds and illustrations for Life magazine. I think if you see it, you'll understand why I'm excited about it. But like a lot of things in the culture, people die, and the population moves on, and not everyone is remembered like Elvis or Marilyn Monroe. So
Sure.
part of my job, I feel, is to help restore the reputation or legacy of forgotten cartoonists.
Well, I'm glad you're making these volumes, really, because you're right, and I think this is one of my constant conversations on this podcast that pre-1990, it seemed like by 1990, everything was pretty much being videotaped and has been digitized since and everything. But it really does seem like at least the first 2/3 and maybe even a little more, maybe the first 3/4 of the 20th century, there's still kind of some murky spots, and you need people to kind of verify, no, this is the way it happened. And, and of course, these people, as they pass away, it's hard to get the straight story these days. So I really do appreciate what you're doing with these histories. And, keep
thanks.
doing it. Absolutely.
Keep in mind, the podcasts are also a history, and they should be preserved, and you're a part of that, too.
Oh, thank you, man. That's my ambition. Again, growing up on Comics Journal and Amazing Heroes and being a radio guy. I work at CBS Radio. That's my day job in Chicago. And, I just felt like it's really important and vital to hear the creators as they're making it and what's on their minds as they're making it and stuff, and have that kind of record. Because sometimes, years later, there's, sometimes rose-colored glasses kind of cloud the memory.
True.
So, and, I meant to ask real fast, did the Image guys, when they were striking out, did anyone of that group ever reach out to you or any of the other, do you know of any other underground guys that maybe the Image guys reached out to?
Well, it's another podcast, but actually when Kitchen Sink was struggling in the late 90s, there was an opportunity to have been acquired or have one of the Image partners invest. And it didn't happen, but we came tantalizingly close. So that's another big what if.
Wow. Pretty interesting. Yeah, something, we exceeded our time, so I will let you go. When there's something new, I will be searching Diamond as well. I hope you will come back, and we can talk more because, you've had an incredible career. And it's a pleasure.
I'd be happy to, John, anytime.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Can't tell you how much I enjoyed talking to Denis Kitchen. What an interesting guy, and really glad he shared our story with us here on Word Balloon today. Hope you enjoyed the show. Brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners via Patreon. If you want to subscribe to Word Balloon, do you like what you hear on Word Balloon? Is it worth your time? Do you think it's worth $1 a month? Is it worth the price of a comic book a month? If so, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon and subscribe. Word Balloon is free. It'll always be free. But if you want to help the cause out, that's where you go. Thank you very much, League of Word Balloon listeners. And Word Balloon also brought to you by Aftershock Comics, who are claiming this year as the year of reading dangerously. They want people to get out of their comfort zone and check out some new comics, and they are coming through with some amazing titles, established titles like Animosity from Marguerite Bennett, and A Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Jimmy's Bastards, Dark Ark from Cullen Bunn and Juan Doe, and Baby Teeth from Donny Cates. Well, they're going to push things even further this year with new titles on the way like Stronghold from Phil Hester and Ryan Kelly, Oberon, a new Supernatural series from Ryan Parrott, Dark Red from Tim Seeley, and Out of the Blue and Horde, just to name a few. In the weeks ahead, we'll be talking to more Aftershock creators about their books, but you don't have to wait. You will find a full slate of incredible books with great genres waiting for you. Full story descriptions, preview pages, and the diamond codes on these books to order through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Thanks a lot for listening. More great stuff coming along in February. Don't forget it as well. Lots of great stuff already happening here in January. Great conversations with Brad Meltzer and Tom King in the previous weeks. And a hospital Q&A that I did while I was laid up and answered listeners' questions. Hope you enjoyed those episodes as well. Looking forward to giving you more great Word Balloon in the month of February. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2019.